Senator Margaret Chase Smith, Republican from Maine. She was elected in 1948 to the Senate. At the time, there were 96 senators, not 100, because Hawaii and Alaska were not states yet. Her speech is from 1950. So she began serving in 1949. And in a year and a half later, she had made one of the most famous speeches of the Senate. During her campaign to move from the House of Representatives to the Senate, to be elected to the Senate, there were some last-minute second attempts to defeat her with smear attacks. They called her a communist. They claimed that she wasn't an American, that she was actually French-Canadian, which was an insult at the time. They claimed she had loose morals. You know, she slept around. She was promiscuous. Her husband had died a decade before, so, you know. This is the beginning of the Cold War. It's after World War II. It's after the atomic bomb. It's the beginning of the Soviet Union. It's fear of communism. It's nuclear proliferation. But this story is not actually about Margaret Chase Smith. It's her speech, but the story is actually about Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin. And Senator Smith served on 2 committees in the Senate with Joseph McCarthy. It was in February of 1950 that McCarthy made a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he said, "I hold in my hands here a list of 205 communists that are in the United States State Department." He later changed that really quickly to 57. It went from 205 to 57. His exact quote, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 people that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping the policy of the State Department. I have here in my hand a list." Secretary of State. Hey, we did a thing on Secretary of State. Hamilton was the Secretary of State. What does the Secretary of State do? What do the people who work for the State Department do? Do. Do you remember? It's pretty important here if you have communists who are working in the State Department. Many people made requests to see this list. Where's the proof, Joe? Where's the proof? After months of waiting, there was no proof of communists in the government that had been provided at all. He would wave around his lists, but never actually offer any proof. Senator Smith says, "It was then that I began to wonder about the validity and fairness of Joseph McCarthy's charges." Friends, journalists, people were urging her, "You have to challenge Senator McCarthy. Like, we can't let him just go on, keep saying this stuff and not say something about it." But Smith said, "I was a freshman senator, and in those days, freshman senators were to be seen and not heard." And according to Smith, the other senators were afraid of offending McCarthy. Plus, it was considered bad manners to attack a fellow senator, so she attacked the methods that came to be known as McCarthyism. That's her. McCarthy is on the left. I don't know who the other young guy is in the light-colored suit, but that's McCarthy on the left. This is before the speech, before they parted ways. In her speech, she agreed communism was a threat. She said that if it made its way into government, that would, of course, be dangerous. She criticized Truman, who was a Democrat, the president at the time, and his government. And she never mentioned McCarthy. But her main points, the most eloquent and fiercest words, criticized the current actions that McCarthy led to attack other people. Anyone who disagreed with him, anyone who held a view that was then unpopular, anyone who protested what was going on. And here's a small segment of what she said. I would like to speak about a serious national condition. It is a national feeling of fear and frustration that could result in national suicide and the end of everything that we Americans hold dear. I speak as a Republican. I speak as a woman. I speak as a United States Senator. I speak as an American. I think that it is time that we remembered that we have sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution. I think that it is time that we remembered that the Constitution speaks not only of the freedom of speech, but also of trial by jury instead of trial by accusation. Those of us who shout the loudest about Americanism in making character assassinations are all too frequently those who, by our own words and acts, ignore some of the basic principles of Americanism. The right to criticize, the right to hold unpopular beliefs, the right to protest, the right of independent thought. The American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds lest they be politically smeared as communists or fascists by their opponents. Surely it is clear that this nation will continue to suffer as long as it is governed by the present ineffective Democratic administration. Yet, to replace it with a Republican regime embracing a philosophy that lacks political integrity or intellectual honesty would prove equally disastrous to this nation. The nation sorely needs a Republican victory, but I don't want to see the Republican Party ride to political victory on the four horsemen of calumny: fear, ignorance, bigotry, and smear. I doubt if the Republican Party could, simply because I don't believe the American people will uphold any political party that puts political exploitation above national interest. Surely we Republicans aren't that desperate for victory. So what was the result of the speech? Well, Margaret Chase Smith, she was removed from her subcommittees. And on the Permanent Investigation Subcommittee, looking for real threats to the United States, she was replaced by a new senator from California, also a Republican, named Richard Nixon. But some people have said that had a man made that speech, he would have become president of the United States. This particular quotes come from an American rich guy at the time who was a major part of World War II, World War I, What happened to McCarthy? Well, he went on a witch hunt. He just got stronger and stronger. It basically became, if you were against McCarthy, then you were against America and you were for communism. During these 3.5 years, over 10,000 jobs were lost. Government employees, journalists, teachers, professors, actors, directors, writers weren't published. People lost their passports. The government would revoke their passports. The FBI would visit some employers just to make sure that these apparent communists, these accused communists, made sure they didn't have a job. You could sometimes save yourself when they asked, are you now or ever have you ever been a communist? And when they said they had proof that you were, it didn't matter. When you denied that you were a communist, they said, well, a communist would deny that they were a communist. It was seriously like the witch trials. You can't prove that you're not a communist. You can't prove that you're not a witch, except for by dying. Well, witches won't die if we do this. Oh, look, they died. I guess she wasn't a witch after all. Why would they lose their jobs if they were accused of being communist? Well, again, because if the employer didn't fire them, well, then maybe the employer's a communist. Let's haul them in to be questioned. Even if you pled the Fifth Amendment, which gives you the right not to put yourself at risk. They would say, well, see, there you are. You're not denying it. You must be a communist. Sorry, I was saying you could save yourself sometimes if you named other people. Well, maybe if you give us the names of some of the other communists that you know, then we can make a deal with you. It wasn't until 3.5 years later, December 1954, that McCarthy was censured, and his career was ended. You can be censured by the Senate and not have your career ended, but his was over. What finally ended it? After 3.5 years, thousands of people losing their jobs, hundreds to thousands of people going overseas to work because they could not get a job in the United States, going to France, going to England. Well, at the beginning of all of this, Truman was in office. He was a Democrat. So if Truman comes out and argues that McCarthy is cracked in the head, well, they're just going to say, well, you're a Democrat. You're just against Republicans who are trying to make this country safe. But it wasn't a great idea to take on the president. And there were some messages exchanged between telegrams, they used telegrams then, between McCarthy and Truman. But then Eisenhower became president, and Eisenhower was a Republican. And then McCarthy decided to go after Eisenhower and the United States Army, specifically one of the greatest World War II heroes, General George C. Marshall. He and the other people who worked with him, here are a couple quotes, but what they said about General Marshall. General George C. Marshall is a living lie. He is eager to play the role of a frontman for traitors. McCarthy wrote 2 books about these Republicans who are traitors, and said specifically that Marshall was part of a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man. And he went over Dwight D. Eisenhower, a guy pretty famous from World War II also, and now a president and a Republican. Executive privilege has been around since George Washington, but it was Eisenhower who actually gave it the name executive privilege. And it was because of McCarthy, and McCarthy calling all these people out in the government and saying, you're a traitor, you have to come in front of our committee, and Eisenhower saying, no one's coming in front of your committee. Do not go. And that was basically the fall of McCarthy. So it wasn't the speech, but it was a woman senator, the only woman in the Senate at the time. 97 men, one woman, his same party, called him out. She was removed from her subcommittees. He goes on for 3.5 years, is finally censured by the Senate. And what does happen to Margaret Chase Smith? Well, she serves for a total of 24 years, most of all of them after that speech. In the 1960s, just after Kennedy was assassinated, she ran for the Republican nomination for president. Now, she didn't come close, but she was the first woman to run for to try to get the nomination from a major political party. She became an expert in foreign policy and military issues, and she served for decades on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And part of that speech that she gave 71 years ago, she said, "The Democratic administration has initially created the confusion by its lack of effective leadership, by its contradictory grave warnings and optimistic assurances, by its complacency. Certain elements of the Republican Party have materially added to this confusion in the hopes of riding the Republican Party to victory through the selfish political exploitation of fear, bigotry, ignorance, and intolerance. There are enough mistakes of the Democrats for Republicans to criticize constructively without resorting to political smears. It is high time that we stop thinking politically as Republicans and Democrats about elections and started thinking patriotically as Americans about national security based on individual freedom."